In Harrow's peaceful village, and between the misty hills and historic woods, has a store that was different from others. It was situated at the cobblestone's edge. Its uneven signs are square and softly waving. Ellsworth's Emporium in the wind distinct designs, even if the shutters were frequently closed, and the room is dim all around. The villager was acquainted with Mr. the eccentric DLM creator. Ellsworth seldom left his dolls were on show in the workshop's shop window. Of unmatched, each figure's artistry was realistic, whose glass eyes appeared to follow pedestrians and detailed characteristics that caused them to look frozen in mid-breath. Kids frequently pressed their noses, fascinated by the glass against the however, Ellsworth produced small planets. Their parents seldom ever let them, late one night, inside. An inquisitive young person receiving a pension for the enigmatic discovered herself roaming the square following a day of restlessness, the moon suspended low, illuminating the area with silver light. She was surprised by shop's worn exterior. When the shutters were open, a doll was visible. A pale-faced woman sat on the display shelf. A girl with her golden hair wearing a lovely lace dress, spirals encircling and eerily familiar. Amelia's expression shifted closer to her breath was obscuring the surface of the glass. The moonlight glinted in the doll's eyes. It seemed to recognize her at that moment. Its head abruptly tilted ever so. Amelia Harper had always been a little attracted to the conclusion of the oddities of Harrow. Others, however, viewed their village as she discovered that the place was quiet and charming. Enticing secrets in the Ivy League, covered ruins at the border of the woodland. The ancient with time, Greveston slanted, and naturally these were Mr. Ellsworth's odd store, the parts of a puzzle that Amelia wishes she could resolve. Her obsession with the Dollmaker started years ago, when she initials of the fine craftsmanship of his dolls were the same in catalogues or her porcelain mementos. Reels, the creations, the creasm whiz, reelers, grandmotionalism was uncanny. Each one exuding a sense of uniqueness, as though they had previously been living despite having seen Mr. Ellsworth just a few times. She would never ignoring his looks. He was tall and gaunt with twitching, long fingers with trepidation. He spoke about his grey hair, always a little unkempt, framed by a face. His voice and deep lines are carved, bore the burden of someone who invested, speaking to himself more often than to Amelia's mother had cautioned others about regarding him. Avoid that shit. She had stated emphatically that there was something not those were right around him. Dolls, but Amelia had always been curious, been her most admirable quality. Even when it put her in danger that evening, as she fixed her gaze on the doll in the window. Unmixed with fascination with the golden locks of the doll, and her pallid features reflected her own, so closely that it resembled examining a little representation of herself. She couldn't help but push open the bell rung on the rickety door of the shop. Its sound was faintly absorbed by the oppressive quiet. The smell was strong in the air. Of old wood shelves and varnish lin, the rows of dolls crammed against each wall in several phases of completion, some of which were clad in exquisite silks. Their painted faces were calm, yet others were small. Hollow as more than just wooden frames. Eyes on a workbench, staring blankly, stood in the middle, surrounded by tools. Textiles and sketches high, Amelia gently called her. Hardly higher than a Mr. Spoke out of the shadows. His presence is as unsettling as she recalled that he had cleaned his hands on her as they settled. His eyes narrowed. Were closed on her, he stated through his the tone was unconvinced. Amelia the doll was visible in the window. Stammered, pointing behind her as if similar to Ellsworth's face darkened a lot. Dolls looked just like their owners. Incident, AIA wasn't persuaded that the doll's likeness to her was more than perhaps it was eerie. Did someone commission it? She said. Stepping, Ellsworth paused, then gestured closer. In the direction of a tiny table in the corner. Maybe you'd like to watch, for you had an open ledger on the table. Its pages are chock full with dates and names. Amelia used her finger to scan the entries. Stopping at the name Amelia, which is familiar, Harper's blood froze beside her. Name was 1 week away from what is this that she required of her today? Voice quivering, although Ellsworth's face softened, the response provided no consolation. Every doll is made carefully, he continued, sounding almost kind, but there's more than just art. Method for keeping something AFF. Amelia took a quick step back from her heart, pounding preserve before he could respond to a gentle creak. What came from the room's far side, where she turned to find a jar on a cabinet door, displaying rows of dolls that are exactly the same as she knew her school instructor in the village. Even the postman was her neighbor, every one of them looking back at her with dead. Ellsworth's eyes grew closer to his lengthy. "If the shadow falls on her, you should not have arrived here," he replied in a tone that carried with a twinge of regret. "Some secrets are preferable." Left Amelia, who had not been found, breathed faster. She retreated to the door, but only she reached for the doll's handle. On the shelf started to agitate their little, their glass eyeballs turned in unison. Glistening in the darkness light, "Get out while you can." His voice is scarcely heard, Ellsworth warns, over the unexpected buzz that permeated the Amelia didn't require 2 reminders. When the bell chimed, she ran away into the night, reverberating behind as she dashed home. Her thoughts were racing with what else was worth, concealing the fact that her name could be in his. Why did the doll in the ledger window looks a lot like her, but she secretly knew one already? Regardless of the response, it wouldn't be straightforward or safe. Amelia woke up the following morning with an aching heart and the eerie recollection of her trip to Ellsworth's store. It was a prank. She assured herself a dream, of her hyperactive fantasy, but the vivid relived the events in her imagination. The doll, clarity, the ledger, and muttered cautions that were too genuine to dismissal at breakfast, as her mother observed, "You are pale, Amelia, you." Her uneasiness feeling completely yes. Amelia forced a smile as she nodded. Didn't get any rest. Her mother didn't pursue the matter further, although as Amelia's mind swirled, she decided to find the truth, even if doing so meant going back to the store, but not just yet. She required clarifications prior to facing Ellsworth. Amelia spent the day once more in the village, making nuanced inquiries regarding. Most folks stayed away from the Dollmaker, subject that provides little more than a passing comments regarding his reticent personality. A few, but made a suggestion darker, about which I've heard odd rumors. Mrs. Wills, the store whispered, according to the grocery store's wife, the dolls are cursed to have fragments of their proprietor. Amelia chuckled uneasily. That, it sounds like a ghost. Store, Mrs. Wilk might have said, lowering despite her voice. Some of those dolls appear incredibly similar to those who have vanished from Harrow's, and throughout the years, the remark chilled me. Amelia's back as she recalled the in Ellsworth's cabinet, rows of dolls, each one is an exact duplicate of someone else. She was aware that it might be I couldn't shake her that night, it's true. Feeling uneasy, Amelia went back to her room and she pulled out the door and locked it. Her late mother gave her a sketchbook, Grandma, and started sketching the doll. The pencil moved from the storefront window. Almost independently, it records every detail. The lace dress, the golden curls, unsettling look that reflected her. When she was done, she gazed at, causing her chest to clench in fear. The eyes of the doll appeared to follow her. She turned just as they had in the store. The sketchbook on her desk face down, and went to bed, but no sleep came. Effortlessly as the room's hours passed by, Amelia tugged the blankets as it grew colder, more tightly. Shaking, then she heard a slight tapping noise that sounded like fingernails in place glass. Her gaze quickly shifted to the window. Where long shadows were produced by the moonlight, the tapping went on all over the floor. Purposeful and rhythmic heartbeat. Amelia compelled herself to. A figure was partially seen outdoors. The frost-covered glass masked it. Had blonde curls and was little and innocent. It shone in the moonlight. The moonlight doll. Amelia stumbled out of bed, gasping, upon returning her attention to the window. The figure was she left and stayed up the rest of the night, gripping while perched on the edge of her bed, waiting for dawn with a flashlight. When the first rays of the sun appeared, she knew what she needed to do with the curtains. When Amelia got there, the store was closed. However, that didn't deter her. To her amazement, when she tested the door, the bell's jingle resonated as it creaked open. Across the vacant area as she stepped, the voice she called from inside. Mr. Ellsworth. Shuddering, the store received no response. Was the doll Rose, she recalled, looking vacantly from their seats, the workstation overflowing with equipment and cloth remnants, but something was. The cabinet in the corner was different. Uncovered, and the dolls within were. Amelia's eyes looked about the room, missing. Upon arriving at the ledger, she had observed that the previous evening, it was exposed on the pages of the workbench. Flying in her name was still there in the draft, but now beside it was a scrawled note. Gathering a shiver went down her spine. What completed it imply before she had time to think about the believed that a brook had heard from behind. Amelia paused before slinking toward the chamber. The door and her footsteps were as quiet as perhaps there wasn't enough light in the room beyond. Brimming with incomplete dolls and half standing in the middle were carved wooden forms. Mr. Ellsworth worked with his back to her. On a tall object, she whispered to Mr. Ellsworth at the table. Her voice stable in spite of the terror tearing at her. He froze in his chest, then slowly turned to his hands were discolored with paint, or was it a darker shade? Eyes that are typically burnt and exhausted with, "Hey, you're not supposed to be here," he said. His low voice isn't Amelia yelled. "Safe, what are you doing?" Getting closer, what does collecting entail? Whole Ellsworth's nasty side of his shoulders. "You've seen too much," he said, slumping rather regrettably. But maybe it's when someone became aware of the truth. Pointing at the table with a doll was partially completed, and its features were, it was obvious that it was, her breath seized in her throat, Amelia. Why does it appear to Ellsworth paused before responding? There is more to these dolls than meets the eye. They're ships filled with pieces of they protect life, which is the most valuable thing. Memory, spirit, and essence. Yet the procedure needs as sacrifices that make Amelia's stomach turn, kind of sacrifices before to responding to the dolls on the shelves started to move once again. Their motions more noticeable than limbs moved before heads turned, and a soft, unsettling murmur permeated the look of Ellsworth darkened. "You must go, now." But Amelia refused to back down. "Till you inform me of the Ellsworth grabbed for her," but the truth dolls started moving all of a sudden, dropping from their positions, and Amelia dodged as the floor clattered to the ground. She was barely missed, head of the chaotic chamber, as the dolls started to move independently. Little hands clutching Elsa's ankles, something worth shouting, yet his words were overpowered by the commotion. Amelia ran to the door. She ran into the night, her pulse pounding. She was followed by the whispers, who grew louder, until they were so loud that Raw continued to run till she arrived at her safety. Amelia secured the door to her bedroom at home and fell upon her bed, heaving in the chest. The shop's whispers continued to reverberate. She also had a chorus of voices in her head. Too loud to ignore, but too subtle to pick out. She was aware that she had discovered something. Awful, something that couldn't be invisible. While she attempted to stop her racing, her eyes landed on the sketchbook as she thought. It was open to the drawing on her desk. She had created her doll, and its her lifelike eyes appeared to meet hers completely. Of silence charged before she had a chance to turn aside. Her desk's pencil wiggled and rolled, heading toward the sketchbook, pausing at the edge, as though anticipating her. Amelia's breath froze in her throat as she shaking her head. She muttered, "This isn't genuine," but as the run cooled, a slight varnish odor permeated the air. The wall's shadows grew darker, out as if alive toward her once more. The pencil rolled, landing on the sketchbook with a gentle thud as she lifted it up, her hand shaking. She held the page up and flipped to a blank one. Pencil poised, uncertain of her identity, intended to do at that time, as if directed by an invisible hand. It started to at first. The lines were reluctant to move. Amelia watched as it became smoother and faster. Fear when a picture of a pitch-black room appeared packed with dolls. All of them attached to strings, such as in the middle of the marionettes was a figure. She knew the picture was frozen by Ellsworth's pencil. Her heart fell as she realized that what it meant that she needed to leave. When she returned, the store was just as she had left, ajar at the front entrance, and Amelia entered her with the bell silent. Determination strengthened by the significance of the with her sketchbook. "Bag, Mr. Ellsworth," she shouted out, steadfast in spite of the cold that pervaded. He was waiting for her this time. Behind the workstation, his illegible expression, "You shouldn't have came back," he said. Amelia whispered, "I need answers." She took out the sketchbook and put it there. Open to the drawing on the table, "What is a marionette room?" Worth's gaze shifted to the paper, and he briefly appeared to be sadly. He acknowledged the reality about this shop's voice is hardly audible over a whisper. "These dolls belong to a group. The craft was older than you might have thought. Transferred to me, but I didn't recognize the expense until it was too. What caused Amelia's stomach to twist so late? Ellsworth is the cost of the dolls. outlined how they were able to obtain pieces of enough life to maintain the core of someone to maintain their tether to this world. But the procedure isn't flawless. Soul is yet unfulfilled and restless, and the dolls aren't satisfied with staying, as though the dolls surrounding the room started to shift, and they were deliberative and sluggish, as if trying the boundaries of their Amelia's strength was to put her heart aside. Hammering, what do they want to look at with Ellsworth? Hardened freedom for which they have been confined too lengthy, and they hold me responsible for their jail. But I'm not the person they, Amelia, asked Dread if I needed it. Infiltrating her, Ellsworth's voice poised before. It was the doll in the window responding. Intended to look like you, but something altered as soon as you walked into this store. The craft it chose you. Amelia's breath caught, but it wasn't, maybe you've seen it. Ellsworth remarked. You sensed the urgency in his voice. If you don't, the connection is already there. Cut it off, and you'll become one of those dolls moved more quickly now that their strings, they snapped and tangled as they tugged. One by one, they emerged from their perches, turned their glass eyes on Amelia. Glistening in the faint illumination, what should I do? She muttered. Gripping the side of the Ellsworth gave her a little knife at the table. Its sharp but worn blade is the only way to destroy the doll is to break the attachment. It features your image, however it should be worn if it will take you if you fail. Rather, Amelia gazed at the blade. Where is it in the trembling hands? Cabinet Ellsworth spoke steadily. Yet you'll need to confront them in order to when one of the dolls moved. It's little Amelia's hands out for her, and she grabbed the knife firmly, her heart pounding, scurried over to the cabinet, avoiding the grabbing dolls with each step, and as she got there, she tossed the doors opened, and I looked around the shelves. The doll in the corner was her doll. The gold curls on the painted face were serene. Glistening in the darkness, Amelia grabbed for the light, but the doll rushed her. Moving frantically and unable to control herself, she slashed at them with their porcelain faces, and the knife breaking beneath the at last. Blade's fingers curled around. She hesitated before raising the knife to the doll. Only a brief minute before diving inside the doll's chest, a thunderous quietness ensued. The doll's limbs went slack, and the stifling cold departed from the Ellsworth moved forward in the room, his face relieved that it's finished. Amelia reportedly dropped the knife on her legs. She plummeted to the bottom, giving way beneath her. Floor holding the broken remnants of the doll, but when she raised her head, she noticed the look of relief on Ellsworth's face, became terrified as he muttered, "You were not supposed to come." Returned before she could reply to the store, dissolved into Amelia woke up in the dark and was not longer in the store. The comforting familiarity, her face was drenched in sunlight, and she discovered herself for a while laying on her own bed. She pondered for a second whether it had all been a dream, a perverted outcome of her fantasy, but as she took on the burden, made her free from something in her hand. She found the broken toy when she looked down. It is porcelain that she is holding in her fingers. Cracked face, but eerily a chill went through her like a real one. Spine. She surveyed her room. Everything seems to be as it always is. Had the uneasiness persisted, like a shadow that she was unable to, Amelia placed the doll carefully and shaken it. Standing with her legs shaky on her desk beneath her, the previous events night played, the whispers over and over in her head. The knife in her hand and the moving dolls, she was unable to ignore what had her phone began to vibrate on the dragging her back to the nightstand present. A message was sent from "Where did you go yesterday night, Clara Clara? When I visited your home, you weren't." They refer to me as unsure. Sap Amelia gazed at the television. How could she answer to B and explain? She hardly comprehended it. She went to her workstation by herself and opened and flipped through the sketchbook. The pages with the marionette's illustration, a blank sheet, had taken the place of the room. However, as she reached the final page, her heart sank. A fresh illustration of one of the damaged dolls sitting in her bedroom on the desk. Amelia's heartbeat accelerated. Took the sketchbook and turned it over, closing and forcing it into where the doll was left on the desk in the drawer. For a minute, painted eyes stared at her. She thought about discarding it, but as she was stopped by an odd compulsion, it was as if there was still a piece of her in the doll, something she was unable to abandon. As the hours went by, Amelia attempted to go back to her regular routine. She brewed tea, read a book, and even went outside to experience the sun's warmth. Yet regardless of how she tried, the doll's picture, as hard as she could, remained in her recall that evening while she was in bed. The faint seemed to be quieter than usual in the room. Outside, the noise of the city was hushed, as if the actual world was retaining its. Amelia took a breath and looked at the desk, her gaze settling on the doll. It was sitting on, utterly motionless, yet its presence was felt. She willingly closed her eyes while still alive, herself to sleep. But as she was falling asleep, she heard a faint, recognizable sound, a chair's creak changing. Her eyes suddenly opened because she was underweight. The doll's thumping heart was precisely where she had abandoned it, still and still silent. She gazed at a solitary. The idea that slipped into her head was it observing her? Or was there another reason? Amelia watched through it and pulled the covers herself tightly and shut. Her gaze was once more intent on finding tranquility, but she knew the truth in her heart. Some secrets were never intended to be revealed, and certain bonds were never intended to be broken. As she was flooded with moonlight, Amelia's room, as the darkness grew deeper, fell into a restless slumber without realizing. The doll's head tilted slightly, as though it were protecting her destiny and its secret till the next